All right, so welcome everybody to our first faculty lecture series event of the fall. And just a reminder that we'll have two more events this fall at this same Zoom address. One Wednesday, November 10th with a representative from the Black Lawrence Press talking about, how to get published and working in the publishing industry. And one on Wednesday, December 1st, in which the topic will be the work of science fiction writer Octavia Butler. But today we'll be hearing from Dr. David Puglia, who is associate professor and deputy chairperson in the English department at Bronx Community College, where he teaches courses in folklore, children's literature, and writing. He's the author or editor of several books on local and regional legend traditions, including South Central Pennsylvania Legends and Lore, Maryland Legends, Folklore from the Old Line State, The Baltimore Hun, The Folk in the City, and North American Monsters, a contemporary legend casebook. He's here today in the Halloween season to talk about his ongoing research into North American legendary monsters.
Thanks, John. And thank you to you and Joseph for setting this up. This is great to get to talk to people about monsters, and to James as well, to talk about monsters and to talk about why we talk about monsters. So I hope everyone's in the pre-Halloween spirit, and if you're not, hopefully you can get in the macabre holiday spirit after hearing about the legendary monsters that roam North America. So I did a book recently on North American monsters titled North American Monsters, a Contemporary Legend Case Book, which will be coming out next month. But this presentation won't exactly be publicizing that book. Rather, I want to linger on the moment I'm in right now, which is at the end of that case book, but before or in the midst of a couple new projects also related to North American monsters, and where I am, what I'm thinking about at the moment in regards to legendary traditions about monsters, creatures, cryptids. And what I would like to see be done in this field over the next few years. So let me give you a little background. Many people who study monsters got into monsters because they love the strange, the mysterious, the unusual, all things weird or morbid. And that's a great reason. I appreciate that reason, but that's actually not why I got into it myself. So for my own interests, I actually got into the study of monsters more out of an interest of teaching introductory folklore. And I noticed that learners would frequently look for reference points when they were learning about folklore for the first time. And of the many reference points, one that was popular was legendary monsters. So specifically, if you have heard of monsters like Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest, or the Mothman of West Virginia, or the Jersey Devil in southern New Jersey, or Cropsey in New York, or the Chupacabra in American Southwest. These legendary monsters, what makes them legendary is that they are purported but not verified to exist. And they have stories that are told about them that hold somewhat together the details of who they are, where they are. So these legendary monsters proved to be excellent teachers who would introduce students to folklore concepts, narrative, belief, and local tradition. And the strange part for me is that once we got past that, there wouldn't be any more real monsters to work with because folklorists don't really do monster study. And I think that makes sense. It's not exactly a respectable thing to study. It's hard to get grants to study legendary monsters. It's hard to impress your provost with legendary monsters. But from a pedagogical viewpoint, I could tell that there was use here. And then also from a popular viewpoint, which I mentioned earlier when we were saying, I was pointing out that tiny little tourist towns will still have 6, 7, 8 books about monsters. John's been hit up for ghost story books. These are a genre that sells well in the popular or public realm. But the bookshelf itself, as I saw it, had been ceded to fabulists who were cranking out fluff and pseudo scholarship. I wanted to see what has been done by academic scholars using the peer-reviewed methods and approved methodologies of our discipline. And so the results are this monster case book that I'll mention, but not dwell on too much, where I tried to show what model case studies had actually been done using ethnographic methods to track down the stories or the narratives surrounding these legendary monsters that have inhabited North America, at least since colonizers arrived, and really earlier, but that are most traceable from that period. And so from that foundation, I thought two pieces were still needed, which are the projects that I'm working on in the future: a cultural history of legendary monsters in North America, and then also an edited collection that shows what others are doing in this realm or this field right now, which includes a lot of really interesting work, such as Mothman and sexuality, Charlie and various lake monster festivals, or just festivals in general dedicated to monsters who may or may not exist across the United States, and the study of Slenderman and other sorts of digital cryptids and this new world for cryptids to exist in. So anyway, that's what you'll see and hear today. And with that, let me get started. And then afterwards, I'll be happy to take any and all questions about whatever, or to just hear what you all have to say about monsters. So John, can I share my screen here? Yes, I can. One moment, please. All right, and you all should be able to hear me immediately. So if you can't, let me know.
Hello, and good afternoon, my dear Bronx Community College colleagues and students. Let me begin by giving you a little background on my research. I'm originally from Maryland, and I've been researching a legendary Maryland monster called Goatman for over a decade now. In some of my earlier research, I wrote a descriptive and exploratory account of the legendary Maryland Goatman based on archival records I had discovered in the Maryland Folklore Archives. In later follow-up research, I went into a more historical, analytic, and interpretive mode, correlating the Goatman legend cycle with the rise of anxieties about crime and serial killer activity in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. The Goatman is a homicidal half-man, half-goat that skulks in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area woods, harassing teenagers and pets. But this presentation is not meant to rehash my Goatman research. Rather, I'm here today to present an overview of my inquiry into legendary monsters like the Goatman. The Goatman served merely as my inspiration, as a starting point, as the reason for asking. My desire was to write a full-life biography of this legendary monster, the Goatman, and I realized to do so, I needed to know more about legendary monsters in general, those from the decades and centuries before the arrival of the Goatman in central Maryland. To use a tired metaphor, I had spent so much time staring at this one tree, I wanted to step back and understand its place within the forest. If I could do that, I thought I could better understand why monster legends emerge in the first place, how monster legends take form, and their patterns of change over time and place. Then, once I'd done that, I'd take all of this learning back to my Goatman biography and be ready to get started. But it turns out this forest was a trap, and as I stepped back to view the forest, I tripped and fell straight down a rabbit hole. Now, there has certainly been good scholarly research into legendary monsters in North America. Some of that research has been conducted by folklorists and legend scholars. With the assistance of those folks, we assembled a North American monster casebook in an attempt to better understand the history of monster legend scholarship on the continent. But as might be expected from a casebook, the results were more of a best hits of a sporadic scholarship rather than a coherent historiography of monster legends. In other words, the casebook amounted to a history of North American legendary monster scholarship, but I was still left wanting a history of North American legendary monsters. I figured in a niche subject, especially one restricted to North America only, the research possibilities would be limited. If I'm really dogged and rigorous, maybe I can hunt down a few dozen well-known North American legendary monsters to tell this story. You know, the big ones, the ones that come up over and over again on these fun internet maps like this, or this, or this.
and I'll keep my data in an Excel sheet so I can play with it later. Okay, well, about a year and over 1,000 monsters later, I reemerged from my rabbit hole and realized I had no idea what I was getting myself into. It turns out there are no less than 1,000 readily identifiable monsters out there in North America. And these are just what I'm referring to as readily identifiable. That is, monster legends that have attracted the attention of folklorists, journalists, bibliographers, podcasters, bloggers, hobbyists, some insider or semi-insider who can reveal inside information to the wider world outside the local community. There are undoubtedly thousands more that are only in local and oral circulation. But as far as knowable or attainable at the moment, right around that 1,000 monster mark, I noticed I had hit the point of diminishing returns. Now, my goal was to do some gatekeeping, to use the trending term. I had to reevaluate monster by monster and assess if each truly met my specifications to identify not just as a monster, but as a legendary monster. I had pulled instances of monsters from an incredible variety of sources, and as a devotee of repetition and variation, my preference was, of course, monsters that were covered in many places, many times, and in varying ways. What this also tuned me to were the huge number of one-time sightings that are reported as monsters. These sightings can certainly become legendary depending on the traction and embrace they receive from the local community, like in the case of the Flatwoods Monster of Braxton County, West Virginia, or the Metal Man of Falkville, Alabama. But I think this is an important point to differentiate, the reason being that outside of legend scholarship circles, people seem to love a good single sighting story, even if the sighting is ambiguous and does not fall within or propagate a legendary monster tradition. And this is important because I would argue folklorists do not try to answer the question, are monsters real? Which irritates non-folklorists or folklore adjacents, but that's the truth of monster research for folklorists and legend scholars. Whether a monster is real might be interesting, but it's not important. Perhaps Jesse Fivecoat puts it best in the introduction to every Encounters episode.
We are not interested in proving or disproving experiences of belief.
I'd like to offer the argument here that folklorists do not pursue the cryptozoological question, whether monsters are real, which is an applied or ostensive act, but rather pursue the folkloristic question of whether monsters are real in legend. Or, to put it in fewer words, is this monster in question, in fact, a legendary monster? As part of my gatekeeping, I had specifications that a monster had to follow for full inclusion in the North American legendary bestiary. My rules don't have much to do with finicky definitions of monsters that scholars fuss over in the monster theory literature. In fact, I'd say my definition of monster is decidedly unfussy. I define legendary monsters as a strange, frightening, or unusual human or creature, real or imaginary, believed or not believed, that is at the time of the telling purported but not scientifically verified to exist in our world. If the subject in question seemed to match my definition of monster, I then went on to check its legendary status. That is, I wanted the monster to exist in some sort of legend cycle or legend-telling tradition, not merely as a single sighting. Even if only one person had ever seen this monster, there needed to be repetition and variation over time, however brief, and space, however contained. Why I belabor this point is because I've found much research into monsters simply fails to differentiate monster genres, ripping legend from context and freely mixing the legend genre with folktale, myth, and literary creation. Such an approach can work if the emphasis is on the monster and not the legend, but such works, even if they are excellent otherwise, make it very difficult to make a larger statement about legendary monsters. Take Jorge Luis Borges' well-known and expertly crafted Book of Imaginary Beings, which under the same covers includes the mythic Cerberus and Minotaur, the literary Cheshire Cat, tall-tale American Lumberwoods characters such as the Gilligaloo, Goofus Bird, and Hidebehind, and legendary creatures like banshees, fairies, and trolls. George Everhart's International Mysterious Creature Bibliography, which is excellent by the way, touches simultaneously on the native mythic underwater panther, the thought-extinct Carolina parakeet, hoaxes like the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, and more traditional legendary creatures like Memphre, the lake monster, all at once. At the other extreme, Linda Godfrey's American Monsters is a book made up almost exclusively of single sighting after single sighting, with most of these anecdotal glimpses not attached to any particular legend tradition. Books like Monsters in America teeter somewhere between the monster as metaphor paradigm and the burgeoning concept of monsterizing, where subjects as disparate as emancipated slaves, communists, and liberated bra-burning women can be seen as monsters depending on the era. To remedy this, it was important to me to pay close attention to the sources from which these monster legends derive. Because of the nature of the subject, I evaluated my sources more like a journalist than an academic. One good source was not enough. I needed multiple confirmation. For any one monster legend, I wanted it to show up in 4, 5, 6, preferably hundreds of other sources as well. I checked and cross-checked my source, not looking for the usual scholarly integrity and validity, but rather checking for repetition and variation over time and space. The sources I used included journal articles, scholarly books, and book chapters, the Maryland Folklore Archives, the Pennsylvania Center for Folklore Archives, Indiana University's Center for Folklore Archives Research, and the Berkeley Folklore Archive, in addition to numerous local and state historical societies. I pulled from historical journalistic accounts. I used books, reference materials, encyclopedias, field guides, and bestiaries. I looked at television and film sources, including Monster Quest, Monsters and Mysteries in America, and Animal X. I used podcasts, including Ben Radford's Monster Talk, Mysteries and Monsters, and the Cryptonaut. I used the Encyclopedia of Cryptozoology, also known as the Cryptid Archives, the Cryptid Wiki, Cryptopia, Pine Barrens Institute, Mysterious Universe, and the Shadowlands. And I used others still. If a monster showed up in any one of these, I was intrigued but always skeptical. When it showed up in more than one place, I began to check for variation. If it held up, I included it in my database. If after all this prodding and teasing, the legend still seemed alive,
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I began to investigate the other factors. Specifically, I wanted to take into consideration name, typology, significant dates, location, and physical description. I began, as one must, with names. Monster names are important and can provide the folklorist with early clues about the legend tradition. It would be difficult for a monster with no name to be said to have anything like a stable legend tradition, even if the name is ambiguous, such as the White Things of West Virginia, or the Beast of the Land Between the Lakes. There must be some sort of stability to carry the legend over space and time, and that stability usually derives from a name. The most common name formula is place plus monster synonym or monster synonym of place, such as the Beast of Bray Road, the Coal Hollow Road Monster, the Dover Demon, the Gloucester Sea Serpent, the Lone Pine Mountain Devil, or the Chilton County Wood Booger, closely followed by noun plus man, such as the Alligator Man, Deer Man, Dog Man, or Mud Man, and somewhat less common, female variants, such as the Basket Woman or the Donkey Lady. On the other hand, some names are intricate and comical, often betraying a literary upbringing, such as the Galley Nipper, the Squidgy-Cum-Squee, and the Whirling Wimpus. My favorite names straddle the perfunctory and the embellished, such as the Abominable Swamp Slob, the Fresno Nightcrawler, or the Woo-Woo. Secondly, I attempted to typologize and categorize. I don't claim any sort of ironclad categorization, but what I can put forward is, in the American monster pantheon, there are more monsters who fit into a handful of traditions than those who did not. While the individual variations of these are what's most interesting, I did find the typology helpful in determining the types of monsters a North American might be said to encounter when wandering the American continent. At its most general, we have the category of monstrous animals, whether they be out of place, like the New York City sewer alligator, back from extinction, like the woolly mammoth, giant mutants, like a 736-pound catfish, or undiscovered species purported to exist, like the side-hill gouger, who lives comfortably on hillsides by having one side of its body shorter than the other. We have the category of humans, or humanoids, including the uncivilized wild men widely reported in early pioneer accounts, in addition to humans with physical disabilities, deranged humans, witches, and if we include the deceased, mummies and zombies. These include the Charman of the Ojai Valley, Bunny Man of Northern Virginia, the Bandage Man of Cannon Beach, and Cropsey of the Catskills. Closely related is the category of hybrid, usually half man, half animal, such as the Goatman of Kentucky, the Pigman of Northfield, Vermont, the Donkey Lady of San Antonio, and Sheepsquatch of Boone County, West Virginia. In its own category, we have Sasquatches or Bigfoots of vast variety, one of the most reported categories in North America, to include the Skunk Ape, the Grassman, the Abominable Swamp Slob, and the Farmer City Monster. Another category, Lake Serpent, competes for the most common monster sightings across North America. These include Champ and Normie and Tessie and Cressy, not to mention Chessie and Bessie and Pressy and Messy and Wessie, each denizens of their own lake in North America. Separate from the serpent tradition, we have the category of other aquatic beings, to include the Beast of Busco, Ugly Merman, and the Boondock Monster. Up in the sky, we have flying monsters, winged or not, to include the Mothman, Bat Squatch, the Snallygaster, and the Van Meter Monster. We have the category of giants, including small giants, true giants, and cannibal giants, often coming from native legend traditions, such as Gugwe and Alaquis. On the other side of the size spectrum, we have the category of little people and goblins, from native tradition, American tradition, and imported European tradition. including the Black-Eyed Children, the Fairies of Newfoundland, the Haunchies of Haunchyville, the Midgets of Midgetville in New Jersey, the Munchkins of Midgettown in Long Beach, California, and the Holy Cross Road Gnomes of Fifield, Wisconsin. We have the category of vampires in their New World guise, including the Vampire Beast of Bladensboro in North Carolina, the Pine Ridge Vampire of Nebraska, the Chupacabra of Puerto Rico and the American Southwest, and the Richmond Vampire of Virginia. We have the category of extraterrestrials, which can stand on their own as legendary monsters, but also can be combined ad nauseum with almost any other legend tradition as an explanation for the monster's sudden appearance without a breeding population or an evolutionary chain, such as the Flatwoods Monster, Osso 1, the Garson Invaders, or the Metal Man. And then we arguably have the category of digital monsters, monsters that live on the internet, though still seem able to pervade the analog world with some frequency, like the Slender Man, Siren Head, and Hat Man. Perhaps most important for my particular research goal of telling the story of legendary monsters in North America, I wanted to pay close attention to dates. There were multiple dates to take into account here. My goal, and I admit this, was a difficult and subjective one, was to see through all of the noise of origination and collection, and to focus instead strictly on the date in which the legend had strength and currency, which would allow me to view the monster legend in the context of its era. More on that later. I also wanted to pay close attention to place. In fact, I made locale central to my criteria for inclusion. Perhaps most important for me in paying close attention to place is working against what I call the Bigfoot Singularity. The Bigfoot Singularity is where each variant is seen as more evidence of the existence of one solitary being, rather than seeing each of these traditions as standing on their own. The latter approach I find to be more honest to the folklorist's monster mission, that is, evaluating which monsters are legendary monsters rather than proving, for example, whether Bigfoot is really out there. By sorting my data in this way, I've been able to manipulate the data alphabetically, which has been helpful in identifying variants within a tradition, geographically to show the dispersion of these monster legends, typologically to show general similarities over very different legendary monsters, and perhaps most important for my particular interests, chronologically. By sorting chronologically, themes began to emerge, and the story of legendary monsters in North America, in a way, presented itself to me. Now this section is in the preliminary stages. What I'm beginning to find is that each period of monster legends corresponds not only to a particular era in North American cultural history, but also to particular folklore genres that intertwine with legend. The first is the era of legend, myth, and monsters in Native America. The second, legend, rumor, and monsters in early America. Third, legend, tall tales, and fearsome critters in frontier America. Fourth, legend, ostension, and cryptozoology in post-war America. Fifth, legend, panic, and serial killers in late 20th century America. And sixth, the era of legend, creepypasta, and viral hoaxes in New Millennium America. Allow me to conclude with this. You can't read a book about monsters without the author stopping at some point to inform you that the word monster comes from the Old French monstre, from the Latin monstrum, portent, or monster, meaning a portent or warning. So in that case, I want to ask, what do legendary monsters portend for the future of monster studies? Some see monsters best offering as material for studying constructions of difference, discomfort, and disgust, especially with reference to race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. These arguments are compelling, but I would point out certainly not new, as they've been part of monster theory from its inception, highlighted as one of Jeff Jerome's 7 theses. Others seem to posit that the digital possibilities of monster studies are the next frontier, of interest to both laymen and legend scholars. But I would point out folklorists and legend scholars have been on that case for over a decade, including numerous excellent publications. Combining the previous two, the digital world and the idea of cryptids, gender, and sexuality seems to be colliding on social media, especially in regards to Mothman, and yet again, I commend, in this case, Ellie Haskin, for being on that case years ago and presenting on the very topic. Others might point out monsters and cryptids as a fashion aesthetic, known as cryptid core, seemingly inspired by vintage 1980s and early 90s fashion, especially as portrayed in nostalgic media, like the Duffer Brothers television show Stranger Things, and Stephen King's movie adaptation of It. And then there's the verb monsterizing, or sometimes monsterization, which emphasizes the emergent, contextual, and performative aspects of legendary monsters. From this perspective, legendary monsters are not found but enacted, encouraging process over text and performance over static entities. This approach is rich with possibilities for the future, but also rife with risk if not used carefully. That is, with a careful distinction between literal monsters and metaphorical monsters. And then there's monsters as an oft-overlooked part of conspiracy theory. That is, monsters as the result, the outcome, the proof, the physical manifestation of purported conspiracy theories. To circle all the way around to where we began, take the Goatman. The Goatman is proof of the strange, forbidden experiments performed at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. The Billywhack monster is proof the OSS was attempting to develop super soldiers in Santa Paula, California to combat Nazi Germany. And the Chupacabra is proof the government is covering up the fact Puerto Rico is a base for extraterrestrial visitation. To conclude, I'd like to return to my initial questions. Where do North American legendary monsters come from, and how are legendary monsters made? I haven't reached a fully satisfactory answer just yet. It's an active case, and the investigation is ongoing. My working hypothesis moving forward is that era and environment shape legendary monsters, and at times, legendary monsters just might shape eras and environment.
Thank you, my dear BCC colleagues and students, for your attendance and your attention. I'm happy to take any questions you might have or to hear about your own experiences with legendary monsters.
All right, and thank you, Leah. That's my presentation. Like I said, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Also, just happy to hear your own experiences with legendary monsters or hear any critiques. Floor is open. Has anyone encountered a legendary monster in their time? Okay, Jonathan wrote in the chat. I'm curious, during your research, were there any shared characteristics between monsters across classifications that surprised you? And if so, what do you believe is the significance of these similarities? So yes, Jonathan, I think that's a good question. It's really artificial to try to do the typology or the classification in the first place. So I think there's so many instances where you could cross-classify the monsters. I think the only reason it's even worth doing is because what I refer to as the Bigfoot Singularity, which I've since have learned is actually a term other people have come up with before for a different thing. So I got to come up with a new term for that. And I've heard that the term that I'm supposed to use is actually called lumping, where you just lump together a bunch of traditions as one. That's the cryptozoologist's term for it. So I think you're right, and it's really something that it's better to just take every individual legend on its own merits. But the value here is because it's so frequent among people who don't take a deep interest in this to lump together multiple traditions as just that one thing, that it's worth the risk of trying to classify them, even though you're absolutely right. The similarities are frequent, and they can vary based on which version of the legend you're hearing at any one particular time. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier with the definition, talking about legends as things that science has not, I guess, given evidence for.
Right.
So
Not verified.
Not verified, yeah. So what are the complications, if any, do you see with kind of looking from that viewpoint at indigenous legends, where it's, almost, one might argue, less a monster and more a part of the environment or something like that, or even just looking at it from that sort of Western scientific knowledge making viewpoint?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, John, and I addressed that. So there's a couple different works I'm kind of pulling from here, and I addressed that in the case book, specifically by pointing out that there are going to be very few native examples in this case book, and it's not because we're leaving them out unintentionally, it's because we're leaving them out intentionally. And the problem with that I think many legendary monster scholars these days are concerned with is that in the past, at least looking at the part of the question about native versus non-native, is that a huge number of native beings were classified as monsters really through a misunderstanding of the culture and a misunderstanding of native typification of their own beings. So what happened was that many sacred beings, which really would be gods in most cultures, were classified rather offensively as monsters. So I think one of the things to do is to stay away from these kind of looking at ancient cultures and peoples and saying, okay, this is a monster, this is a monster. So I think the way folklorists have kind of approached that is we're looking at now monsters that we can study ethnographically that are in our own backyard that are actually identified as monsters by the people who live with that legendary tradition, rather than misclassifying based on ethnocentrism. And then you also mentioned the part with science, and so it's also an interesting working with scientists, because scientists are also interested in cryptozoology. There are new species found every year. They're usually very tiny species, but that's a constant tension that's always very interesting. Like, is there really anything new out there to be found? And the scientific verifiable answer is yes, just not necessarily anything that you just saw in this presentation. Thank you. Terry, you used the raise hand feature. Hey, Terry, good to see you.
Hi, good to see you too. So this is not a question, but
A comment.
A comment, yes.
Very good.
I believe I sent you a photo one morning on my way to play tennis on the Upper West
Yeah,
Side.
like a graffiti mural sort of, yeah.
So it was on, that's around 181st Street, and I meet a friend every week to play tennis up there. And there, I don't know if you know that area, but it's right on the Hudson River, and there's this really beautiful park. And the tennis courts are right next to this very grand stone staircase.
Mm-hmm. I know it. I do know it, yes.
And I had this really strange experience, and I completely blame you and your assignment over the summer, where I learned about mole people because it's traumatized me. So as I was playing, I heard this loud noise, and I turned around, and this door that's underneath the staircase was opened. And I stood there because it was like I played there now for 6 months, and I've never seen anyone go through it. And so I stood there for a solid like 5 minutes. No one came in, no one came out. And I turned around, it shut. And the first thing I thought was the mole people are coming to get me. So I just want to let you know that that's your fault, and I cannot stop thinking about that.
So is everybody familiar with the mole people, which would be one of the legendary creatures of New York City? Mole people, of course, live under the ground in New York City, but it's not the only. In New York City, we also have the alligators in the sewers, which has been throughout the 20th century a longstanding legend of what's in the sewers in New York City. So we have, even though often folklore is associated with rural places. Thank you, Terry, for bringing that up. That we have our urban cryptids and our urban legendary monsters as well. Just not, yes, thank you, Jonathan. The Ninja Turtles and their sensei live in the sewers of New York as well. So we do also have this in urban areas. And as we were talking at the very beginning, it would be nice to have more thorough studies of what exactly is and is not in the Bronx, which I don't think has been done as well as has been done in other parts of the country or even of the city. Other questions? Well, thank you everybody for attending. I've started to do the pre-recording of my lecture, so I'll post it to YouTube if anybody has anything they would like to see or revisit from there. Yeah, and thanks so much for your interest in being here today.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.